Hey everyone, welcome to the EarthRise podcast. I'm Derek Barris, and this is episode 91, where I get to talk to a very influential figure on my recent work in mental health and antidepressants, Robert Whitaker. He is the author of Mad in America, as well as this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, which are the two books we discuss. He actually authored 5 books so far, and he's an American journalist and runs the website Mad in America that I source a lot of wonderful scientific research from. They have some great writers there, and they cover really important content. As you'll hear in this discussion, we basically frame the conversation around the history of antidepressants and the problem of their increased usage, specifically the problems of creating more mental illness in the mind of American citizens in order to sell prescription drugs, which is endemic. It's been happening for a long time, and it's increasing right now. In fact, as you'll hear me mention in the conversation, in March, there was a record number of prescriptions of Zoloft in America, and the FDA announced that there is now a Zoloft shortage. There's so many things that I can preface this conversation with, but I'll just say that my forthcoming book, Hero's Dose, really changed because of Robert's work. It is on the history and usage of psychedelics in ritual and therapy, and it was always designed to be half memoir, half research. But what I realized as I got deeper into this story is just how much we've been sold on this idea of mental illness, specifically anxiety and depression. And people do suffer from these problems, but the ways that we go about it is increasingly problematic. I could go on, but we talk about all these subjects during the talk. And it's, again, one of those interviews where as I'm reading Robert, I have an image of him in my head. And you always hope that the person you get to talk to is actually that person. And I have to say, it was just like catching up with a friend and talking about these issues. He's a lovely person, really informed on the long-term and systemic problems that have happened in the mental health industry in America. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I do. And I will see you next for my conversation with R.P. Eddy, the co-author of Warnings, which will be talking about the prediction of this pandemic that he had in 2017 in that book. All right, enjoy the conversation. I'd like to start with backtracking just a little bit. And what inspired you to start this line of work specific to, I know you've written a few different books, but specific to psychotherapy, psychiatry, and antidepressants?
Well, it really was all serendipitous, to be honest with you. I did a series for the Boston Globe, co-wrote a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings, and that was going to be it. But while I was doing that research, I came upon a World Health Organization study that there were 2 such studies on outcomes for schizophrenia patients. It was a cross-cultural study in 9 different nations, and both times they found outcomes were much, much better in the poor countries, to quote the developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, than in the US and other rich countries. And the World Health Organization actually concluded that living in a developed country is a strong predictor you'll have a bad outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you'll fail to recover. And so I just wondered, why would living in a developed country with all our, sort of advances in medicine, that sort of thing, be a predictor you'll have a bad outcome? And anyway, it was that failure that got me interested in this whole story, because the common narrative was how we were making progress in treating mental disorders, right? We were finding that they were due to chemical imbalances. We had drugs that fixed those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. Now, that's a metaphor of great medical progress. And yet, here was this cross-cultural study finding something much different. And then when I looked into that cross-cultural study, I found that they used antipsychotics very differently. They used them short-term, but not long-term. So it's so that also went against what I knew to be true. And then the final thing was that launched me into this whole writing, this interest, was I also came upon a Harvard study which found that outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the US had declined in the last 30 years and were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. that also belied this narrative of progress. So really, I got interested into it in this whole subject because there was a common narrative, which, by the way, I believed in when I was writing, reporting on medicine for newspapers and all. And yet I was coming upon research that belied that narrative of progress. And that's how it all got started. And I wrote one book called Mad in America. Then I returned to the subject for Anatomy of an Epidemic. And that's when I really started looking at antidepressants and their long-term effects.
I also have a personal story with this. I suffered from anxiety disorder for about 25 years. I had hundreds of panic attacks. 2 put me in the hospital. 1 caused me to black out in a restaurant. So the way that I was actually able to overcome it was by stopping a long-term vegetarian diet over 20 years and going back to eating meat. And that I wasn't doing that. I was doing that to address GI issues, but it actually stopped my panic attacks. And it's been over 4 years since I've had one.
Wow, that's interesting.
Which the diet aspect, which made me really think about carbohydrate intake, because more than eating meat, but that's a separate story. But in that time, there was a really drastic period of panic attacks where I just being in certain areas would trigger them. And that is when I actually saw professional help. And I was prescribed Xanax, and I was on it for about 6 months, not daily, just when I needed it. But rereading, because I read Anatomy of an Epidemic when it first came out, and then reread it recently as I'm working on a book right now on psychedelic therapy. My doctor said, and I'll never forget it, mental, what you're going through is no different than any physical disease.
Right.
And so when I reread, thinking about Howard Rusk's New York Times article from the 40s, it just struck me really hard. That was the moment where I was like, I was sold on that too. And there's such a conspiracy of forces that came together. What were you thinking when you were doing all this research and realized the AMA working with the government and the pharmaceutical industry all kind of agreed that this was the proper way to move forward with mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I struggled with that, to be honest with you, because I love science. I think it's one of the most beautiful manifestations of the human mind, scientific inquiry and openness of mind. And what I gradually came to understand was we weren't seeing the presence of a scientific mind in this whole creation of this narrative. What we were seeing were guild interests at play. And what really came together, of course, pharmaceutical companies have an interest in, you said you were sold this is like any other physical disease. Now, the reason that works so well for a commercial narrative is I can't get a drug approved for anxiety at life or something, you know what I mean? Or general unhappiness or neurosis or whatever you want to call it. But I can get a drug for panic disorder. I can get approved for something seen as a biological condition. Yeah. So first of all, and that, by the way, from a pharmaceutical point of view, is if you can create a narrative where so many of the ills of life, the discomforts of life, and there are many types, right? I mean, being in your mind is not an easy state for virtually everybody, I think. You're going to expand your market dramatically, because when before 1980, which is when, by the way, panic disorder was first identified as a specific disorder, the group of things that were seen as biological actually was pretty small. And so it's going to be hard for the pharmaceutical market to really expand beyond that. And that's what happened from the pharmaceutical point of view. And then it took a while, but to understand, well, why did psychiatry want to tell this tale? Because psychiatry, in the 50s and 60s had a lot of Freudian impulses and psychodynamic thinking and that sort of thing. Well, what you saw in the 70s was a guild that did see its survival as a medical discipline, or even as a discipline, under attack. Like, how good are its talk therapies? Not particularly good. How good are its diagnoses? Not particularly good, neither valid nor reliable. And it was the benzodiazepines were cropping up, because those were the first real popular psychiatric drugs. There was problems with addiction, problems with withdrawal, problems with lack of efficacy over time. So in the 70s, the American Psychiatric Association as a guild felt threatened. Diagnoses were being challenged, the merits of its drugs were being challenged, and it was in competition with a big burgeoning other types of talk therapy, counseling, other ways of approaching wellness. And so literally you can see they're saying, well, how can we rise above this competitive fray? And they say, well, what image has such power in American society? It's the white coat. We all know that. And they said, we literally, not figuratively, literally need to put on the white coat. And if we call these things diseases of the brain, we're now like in that field of almost infectious disease medicine. And when you start doing something like this, you're going to start telling yourself a story and you're going to want to believe that's true, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see psychiatry trying to convince itself that these are chemical imbalances. And there's a really key moment in 1984 when Nancy Andreasen writes a book called The Broken Brain. I don't know if you remember that book.
I do not.
It was real big in 1984. This was the book that everybody was talking about as the book that signaled a shift in how we were going to think about psychiatric problems, psychological problems. Before we thought it was, maybe whatever, influences of your parents, setbacks in living, divorces, that sort of thing where it causes so much problems. They said, no, these are diseases of the brain, much like cancer and heart diseases. Okay, so this is the moment they're going to sell this new narrative. But if you actually read the book, it says, this is a hypothesis, and we actually haven't found this to be true, but we're confident we will in the future. Anyway, this narrative that was launched with 1980 did elevate psychiatry status in American society, its power, its domain, its authority over our lives, and pharmaceutical companies now begin sending money to academic psychiatrists to tell the story and to the APA because it's a story they love, because it's going to expand the market. And then, you get this, what's called a capture of another organization. When you have all this money, that's going to help you capture that other organization. And even more important, they were giving huge sums of money to leaders at academic medical centers, psychiatrists to be their consultants, advisors, speakers. Now, final thing on this, trying to understand your question, how did this happen? When I'm a pharmaceutical company, and I go to a professor of psychiatry at wherever it might be, Harvard Medical School or Johns Hopkins, Stanford, I basically try to buff up your ego. You are the greatest expert in the world on this subject. We need your expertise. That's why we're going to pay you $500,000 over the next few years to give talks about panic disorder and this drug. And we're really still thinking about panic disorder. But, at some point you'll slip in about this drug, basically, is what it is. And the person, whether it be man or woman, is not saying I'm being bought. They say I'm being paid for my expertise. And as that happens, they're going to believe that these are brain diseases. Maybe we don't have all the data. And they're going to be looking for data that says, yes, this is an evidence-based treatment, and in their own minds, they're going to avoid all the evidence that raises questions. So that's a long-winded answer, Derek, but just to get away from the conspiracy theory, when you see it in this light, you can see why monetary interests from pharmaceutical companies are at play and guild interests are at play. And we do know that people are ultimately often self-serving in this way.
Yeah. And when I use that word, it actually, as I was saying it, because I actually have another podcast about conspiracy theories from the right wing infiltrating the wellness industry, which is what I work in mostly. So that word, I meant more of just like conspiring, right? Of these different industries. And it makes me think too, and I'll use this on something that I just published this morning on Big Think that I found on Mad in America, which is such a great resource. And your writers are excellent in covering, these studies. But so say this did, if you start in the 1940s, 50s when it started, and then that resurgence in the 80s after Nixon's war on drugs and then them coming back into it, I really feel that a lot of psychiatrists and general practice doctors who gave me Xanax that is what they believe because they're taught that way. They don't, and there's good intentions there. I don't think they're all in on this in that sense. But looking at it, and from the, again, psychedelic therapy standpoint, which is what my brain's been in for the last year, one of your writers just published a story that I then followed up on, which was on ketamine, and showing that, I don't know if you saw this, but
I know the story, yeah.
okay, great. It's been the first psychedelic, even though traditionally it's not actually psychedelic, but considered the first psychedelic to be used for treatment in depression. And now you're seeing that the pharmaceutical company was not exactly honest with the evidence that let esketamine become approved by the FDA. And
Right.
so, the way that it was posited on your site was that we're doing the same thing over again. How do we break that loop?
Oh, wow. This is a good question. This is an extraordinarily big question, actually.
Yeah.
And it's when we talk about psychedelics or psychiatric drugs, it's actually not limited to those drugs. Because ultimately, okay, there's a couple of things you touched on here, Jerry. The first thing is the ordinary practicing doctor is following what they're told to do these days. This is the evidence-based practice. And they think, okay, I'm not the one that actually vetted this information, but this is what I'm told to do. And these are our protocols, and I'm going to do it. And if I do it, if I prescribe the drugs, I want them to work. Not only do I want them to work, I got to see them working. So I'm going to have a way to view you and talk to you unconsciously to sort of reinforce that this is a good thing to do. I mean, that's what doctors do. They don't want to think they're doing harm, which is going to your piece. The problem goes back to this. There's the immediate problem that if you have a funder, someone with a commercial interest, the pharmaceutical company, in getting a drug approved, what they're going to do is they're going to design the study in ways that make their drug look good. And there's all sorts of tricks that you can do. Okay, that's the first thing. Just design it. And one of the things you can do in terms of side effects is just don't look for them. In other words, if you sort of know there's certain side effects, then don't put them on your side effect checklist that you check for. And you won't get nearly as many sort of spontaneously reported actions. And then there's other ways to bias your results. And then, of course, they're the ones that actually look over the data and, organize it, for scientific reports and all. So the first problem is that we have people who are done funding the trials, the studies of these drugs, by and large have a vested interest in seeing them approved. But the second thing is really this. Even our mechanism of approval is misunderstood. So you think a drug, and I don't mean you personally, I'm talking about people in citizenship, citizens of the country. They think, a drug's been approved by the FDA. That means it's safe and good for you. It provides a benefit. The FDA isn't actually saying that. It's not actually saying, for example, that the benefits outweigh the harms. What it's saying is we have this sort of standard for approving a drug, and that is if you can show 2 trials where it had a statistically significant benefit on the symptom over placebo, then that's sign of efficacy. And just, I'll give you an example. So let's say you have a drug that provides a relief of symptoms in 20% of people, okay? And in placebo, it's 10%, okay? Now, how many people in that thing do not benefit from the drug? 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
Okay, 9 out of 10. There's only the extra 10%. Now, how many people are exposed to the adverse effects of the drug? All 100, right? But they'll pass that drug because it meets this small standard of benefit over a placebo. They're not saying, on a target symptom. And they're not subtracting actually the risk. They're just saying we're going to warn of the risk. It's up to the doctors to decide whether, for whom to give this drug, how long, and whether, really it's helpful. We were just saying it's met our societal standard for getting it on the market. But that is understood as something very different. It's understood as this drug works for you, it's going to provide a benefit, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing that's missing is we don't have anything about measuring long-term exposure. So you said now you were on it only on an as needed basis, Xanax, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, that's different. But if you look at Xanax, for example, it doesn't show any efficacy after about 4 weeks. So if you're taking it on a daily basis. So you really should get off it. But all sorts of people have been on it for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. But we don't really have a mechanism for assessing what happens to people on these drugs 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years. And it's not just psychiatric drugs. We don't, there's all sorts of long-term use of drugs, medicines, that we really don't know the harm, benefit, risk.
You mentioned a word, and it's something I'm fascinated by, and I've written about this a number of times over the years, but I from a pharmaceutical company perspective, I understand the answer, but why does the medical research, just in general, the healthcare, not understand or talk about the power of placebo?
Well, yeah, okay. This is really great because all these things go to really larger questions about how we, as a society, think about wellness, think about illness, and that sort of thing. And what doctors should be doing. What happens is, I think a lot happened in medicine. There's been a lot of changes in medicine. But the benefits of antibiotics really created a mindset in our society about how effective drugs could be for whatever ails you. And it really set into motion this idea that medicine could come forth with pills that could help whatever you might be presenting with, okay? In terms of GI issues, whatever it might be. And you see this, rapid rise in the use of prescriptions and all. Well, increasingly, doctors also found themselves in a position where people coming to them were hoping to leave with a prescription. You can't write a prescription for placebo. Probably be very helpful if you could. And in fact, I'll tell you a funny story in just a second. But that's part of sort of, what do they call this? There's a word for this, but it's like there's a good word for this. Anyway, I'm forgetting it right now. But that the interaction between doctor and patient is so much actually a placebo interaction, because the patient comes from help. They think the doctors has a sort of magical potions, and they want to leave with that magical potion, right? It's sort of in our mindset. Now, a long time ago, you'll sort of laugh about this. After I left daily reporting, and then I had a company that covered the business ends of developing new drugs. And then when I was writing my first book, I actually did some work for a consulting firm that looked at, that had as its clients drug companies, and was looking for strategies for drug development. So it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek piece, but I said, you need to, what would be really successful is a placebo for depression. Put in something that makes you, like, there are something called active placebos that you get it like dry mouth or something. And active placebos in all the studies are just as effective as antidepressants over the short term. So I said, why not develop an active placebo as an antidepressant, and your adverse effects you can minimize this way. You can minimize the dosage. Now, here's the funny thing is, I thought the company, which is charging a lot of money to the drug companies, would be pissed as hell about this piece, right? Because they're charging them a lot. They got a lot of compliments, actually. Sort of a lot laughing, but also a lot of people saying, boy, that is a perspective to think about. Because I went over all the studies of active placebo for antidepressants, and there was only one, I think, of 8 studies that separate.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating, especially, again, I've written a number of pieces on homeopathy, for example. And if you're getting into the more intense provings where there's no active ingredient, the mechanism of action by which it works is placebo. That's pretty basic understanding. People who work in that industry got very mad. One piece, I had over 1,000 negative comments from people because they were just, and even now I have because one of the lanes I cover now is the anti-vax movement. And I've had homeopathic doctors come after me about that. And I tell them, that Samuel Hahnemann loved the concept of vaccines because he thought that it proved what he was trying to do. And so again, it's just this disconnect
Yeah.
between the historical uses of science that people don't always look into. And one that
most people don't recognize Hahnemann's name. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that there was a university in Pennsylvania, or college, so named.
Yeah. And the other piece of history that I dove into with your book was moral therapy, and I found that quite fascinating. And I'm wondering if you ever foresee a return to that sort of model. I mean, we do kind of have it on a small scale, but that's usually expensive. Like if I think about like addiction treatment centers in Malibu, or something like that, it's available to a small amount of people.
Yeah. By the way, can I say one thing about homeopathy?
Sure.
Because if you didn't mention that maybe it could be useful, they're going, what, you believe in like magic or something like that? I know, I believe in the placebo effect. Yeah. That fits exactly what you're talking about. Let's say a doctor gives you a homeopathic remedy. You leave with something, right? You leave with something you believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And we all know that that's a powerful thing. I'm pretty good friends with Irving Kirsch, who's done a lot of the placebo research. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of what he talks about. It's you believe you got a powerful potion, and in that belief itself, obviously can be healing in terms of how you view yourself after. And by the way, you know this probably better than I, but you see placebo healings in not just with the psychiatric problems. You can see placebo effects with physical problems as well sometimes. So anyway, that's the homeopathy story. What was what I didn't hear?
Just your history of moral therapy.
Thank you.
And how it was used, and then how it just kept going more and more towards instead of lifestyle and relaxation, it became more regimented over the 19th century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moral therapy, which was developed by the Quakers, for your listeners, in the really the last few years of the 18th century, in the 1790s and all. But it really was this idea, and I love the humility in it. It was talking about people who've gone mad, etc. And they said, we don't really know what causes madness, but here's the key. But we do know they're brethren, okay? They're humans like all of us. And they say, what do we like? What do all of us like? Well, we like a comforting environment. We need shelter. We need food. It's good to have interests. It's good to have socialization, respect towards each other. And one of the beauty parts of moral therapy is they wanted those who were creating these residences, these homes out in the country. By the way, they thought nature could be very healing. Diet could be very healing. A little glass of port at 4 p.m. was seen as good. But my favorite part of the moral therapy approach was they would hold a mirror, so that would reflect the image of, quote, the mad, that reflected back not the image of a mad person, but the image of someone who could be in society, who could be with others without fear and stuff. So what they were really trying to do was create an environment where people felt safe, where they found some meaning, and they felt respected as well. So that's part of that sense of, and they had people, for example, dress well. They would have dances, this whole, and it was found to be, historians have gone back, and if you look at first episode psychosis, and if you look at the medical notes, these people with first episode psychosis in the early 1800s are psychotic. I mean, they're really having trouble assessing reality. Well, they found with this sort of comforting environment that many, many people, about 2/3 of psychosis would abate naturally over time, and most would never come back to the hospital. In other words, they would have a time of psychosis rather than a chronic illness. So what the message there is, it's very different. Our drug-based is we're going to fix something wrong with the inside of your head, right? This is a talk about fixing sort of the environment you move through. and creating a new environment, which, by the way, does include good food and that sort of thing, rest. But the biggest thing is the idea is that human beings and their health, their mental health, arise within environments, not just on their own inside your head. And so the idea is that environments of certain sorts can be very healing. And we lose that. The irony was it was seen as successful. There's all sorts of looking at discharge rates. And then in the 1850s, what happened, it was so successful that we had this reformer named Dorothea Dix. She actually got healed by going to a moral therapy asylum run by the Quakers in England. She came back and said, this needs to be a public service. And so honestly, states responded in many cases by the first great public works project, building moral therapy asylums in the country for people who are struggling with their minds. But what happened was they became nursing homes. States and counties began dumping in people with Alzheimer's, end-stage syphilis, all these neurological disorders. And of course, they grew greatly in size. And once that happens, the sort of comforting environment is gone. We start to see a failure. Moral therapies start to be seen as a failure. And the response of asylum doctors was, oh, we got to revert to medicine. We got to revert to somatic therapies. And that's what happened. And we lost that. Now, there are some places that are sort of revisiting environmental care. If you look at open dialogue therapy as practiced in northern Finland, which took hold in the 1990s and really has produced the best outcomes for psychotic patients, it's all about creating a different environment and meeting the spaces in between people as opposed to focusing on healing the head of one individual. Been very successful, changed the course of first episode psychosis. Now, the closest you see today of sort of moral therapy approaches, there's a budding movement in Israel for something called soteria houses, where in fact, they're smaller houses, maybe with 8, 10, 12 people in them at a time, with staff that be with them. And the idea is you'll create these environments, and they're not drug-centered. You can take antipsychotics if you want. If you don't have to. And those places, by the way, when I visited, it was sort of fun. I mean, there were people in different states and that sort of thing, but you could get into really intense conversations quite quickly. As opposed, if you're in a mental hospital today, people are pretty heavily medicated. There's not nearly so much interaction. So what happened was we lost historical memory of the healing power of environments from the early 1800s. And there is some growing sense, I think, of maybe that's what we need to do, is create these healing environments as trying to just fix the individual's head with a drug.
That's what a few months ago, I wrote an article on the concept of universal basic income being used as an antidepressant, for example. And the set and setting, Timothy Leary's term, and he did some damage to the reputation of psychedelics, but I think that concept that when you're doing psychedelics, your mindset and the environment and people you're around is equally important, you can extrapolate from that and put that into concept of mental health, which makes me wonder, I grew up in a town you might have heard of, I know you heard of, it's called Milltown.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
course.
So that's where I grew up. And what's so fascinating about that is I remember probably in college finding out the story of the drug named after the town I had lived in for 18 years. And this idea that, it's very, right in the center of town is a mill pond, and it's very tranquil and, it's very calm, but it's an extremely racist community. It's a right wing predominantly, and it's why I got out as soon as I was 18, but so it almost is a perfect metaphor, because on the surface, it looks very tranquil, but underneath there's a lot of aggression that lives in it.
Yeah.
And for Milltown itself to become really, I mean, if I'm correct, kind of the first blockbuster drug, the first tranquil.
Oh, no, it was. It was very much.
And so that shows that there was also, even though you had these forces coming in with this new model, it also shows a public willing to buy into it. And I'm wondering what you think about the culture, both then and now, that allows for this concept and these drugs to really take hold. I mean, you can look at opioids as well, right?
Yeah,
Like we consume over 90% or something of the world's
yeah.
opioids. Like, what is it about our culture that has happened that makes us look for relief from distress and pain in such great quantities?
It's a very good question.
The big, I mean,
A
I know
good
it's a
question.
lot, but
And I'm not sure it's exactly the same today as it was in the 1950s when Milltown came in. Milltown came in, though, again, it arrives after medicine has been newly revolutionized by antibiotics. I mean, that's the first thing. And you had people saying, we're going to vanish. You can go back to the 50s and we're going to vanquish all illness, all disease. Our powers are so great. Remember, polio vaccine comes in 1954 as well. So the idea was there was this hubris. Oh, we can like tame nature. And as part of this, there was also this a sense that almost we can eliminate misery or something. Okay. Now, if we go back to Milltown, there were a lot of stresses in American society at this time, the 1950s and all. And think of the place of women in society at this time. And there was, and then it combined with marketing, okay? Because if you see when Milltown was announced, I forget the company that brought it to market, but it was basically Milltown can bring this drug can bring tranquility to your house. It can make everything feel good. You'll feel better than ever. So there was a marketing message that went around that was very powerful too. So that if you internally felt some of these stresses of life, which comes from a philosophy of being, right? You're being sold a new philosophy of being. You can be happy. Your family can be happy. Your wife can stop complaining about you from the men. I mean, this is how it was sold in the 50s. I'm just saying this was part of what was sold in the 50s. And, so it's a mix of advances in medicine that created belief systems and then an unbelievable marketing campaign in the capitalist society. And, we're also, we exist in a for-profit health system, unlike other countries.
Yeah.
So like everything else, big companies are really good at creating demand, using marketing to create demand. And so if you look at sort of the selling of the SSRI antidepressants, Prozac and Zoloft and, et cetera, that marketing is really good. You're going to feel better than well. You go on your TV. Next thing you know, you're walking on a beach with a beautiful girl or a beautiful man, and all your troubles go away. Listen to the music. I mean, and then they're good about planning stories in the media. So what I'm saying is, if you look at these two different times, is one, we see marketing. Two is the marketing is done within a context of where we do believe in drugs, okay? We believe in the magic pill. So the marketing takes advantage of that. And the third thing, it is offering an ease from the many stresses of a society, including racism, including gender problems, marital problems, inequality, all the problems you see. It's like this thing will set things right. And what also is missing here is, what does it mean to be alive? In other words, what philosophy of being governs our thinking about what we should expect? Now, I think there was a time when, so if you would have met my grandmother who immigrated here and was poor, she didn't expect to be happy. Happiness really wasn't in her, vocabulary. What she expected was to survive, and grew her own food and worked hard. And in that concept, there almost wasn't in her own mind much of a place for worrying about not also happiness, but also depression. She just worked all the time. So did her husband. And also I'm saying, if you combine that sort of thinking about life with any sort of existentialism, that suffering is part of life and that we struggle with our own minds. And by the way, that human beings aren't steady state beings. We've gotten this idea that, oh, like, if you don't like school when you're 6, you're not going to be a good worker when you're 22 or something, ADHD. Everything we know about human beings is they have changes. They change as they go up, their minds change. Your mind changes as you go older. You're not a steady state. Sometimes you're miserable, sometimes you're happy. So there's also a failure of philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And going through my notes on your book, it's seeing that the number of ADHD cases that have risen, something like 35-fold in 25 years. I mean,
Yeah.
if I'm about to turn 45, and growing up in the 80s, I mean, at 6 years old, I walked a half a mile to school. Right. So I even now, I grew up in a very different time, but I would have been put on something because I was hyper, and the idea that our prefrontal cortex doesn't develop fully until we're in our early 20s. And so the idea of taking 6-year-old kids and putting them on these drugs is insane to me in a lot of ways. And so right now we talked about the, Milltown and the culture then, but 2 articles come to mind right now. First off, the record number of prescription of Zoloft in March of this year. I think it was like 4.9 or 5 million prescriptions. So the FDA announced that we're having a shortage of Zoloft. And, yeah. You pointed out, because I also work in fitness as a fitness instructor, you pointed out that in your book, Zoloft seems to negate the positive effects of physical exercise. And then the article I was reading this morning about the mental health crisis because of the pandemic, especially in teenagers, and the increasing rates of suicide. And there was no correlation made in that article about how many of them were on any antidepressants, but we know that it is an increasing number of people. And so do you foresee right now, I mean, we're reckoning with so many aspects of our culture, the for-profit healthcare system being a big one right now. What steps can be taken here, not with this administration, obviously, but hopefully with a new one, that can help to mitigate some of that damage that has been done, especially to younger people?
I think in a way, this is one of the biggest moral questions of our time. How do we raise our children? I think the biggest moral question of our time is climate change. Cool. If we don't respond to that, we're really screwing the future generations. But it is a big question. How do we raise our children? And what has happened is we've created a pathologizing environment for them. Now, why did we do that? Well, because if you go back, you mentioned Zoloft and all, in the early 90s, the drug companies were saying, the adult market for SSRI antidepressants is being saturated. And, where's the untapped market? It was kids. Now, you'd already started to see that also with the stimulants for ADHD, but basically what you see post-1980 is that market forces, pharmaceutical companies, work with academic psychiatry to all of a sudden start talking about all these childhood disorders and you needed to medicate them, blah, 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 blah. What I find particularly distressing is that all the data you can find on medicating kids is ultimately negative, even on symptoms, on cognitive function, on social functioning, academic achievement, and most frightening of all, since you open this with ideas of how the frontal lobes develop over time and don't even finish developing until like the early 80s. Well, all our animal experiments show that the drugs affect that brain makeup, that brain development, that sort of thing. So if you look at the harm done, in my opinion, from medicalizing childhood, pathologizing childhood, it's so broad-based. So first of all, kids are at some point taught to monitor their own self. And if they find themselves sad, that's wrong. That's abnormal. Whereas in the past, you might think like, hey, I'm sad today. And that's something that happens. But you start monitoring your own mind to see, are you happy? You're expected to be happy. If you're not happy, that's a problem. And that leads to, very quickly us thinking something's wrong with me. So we've really created a situation in our society where kids are primed to think something's wrong with me. Parents are primed to think something's wrong with me, with my kid. By the way, and going back to moral therapy, do we ask about the spaces kids inhabit today? You got to walk a half a mile to school today. How many kids get to walk a half a mile to school today? They don't, right? Because there's so much fears in this. How many kids feel pressure by the time they're in second grade to start getting good grades because they have to worry about getting into college? So it begins with this whole sort of, when you start pathologizing kids, you have to sort of create a narrative that helps drive people into the abnormal category, kids, into using the drugs. And then we have all this evidence that it isn't benefiting kids. And what do we see during this time? We've seen rising suicide rates from 2000 in kids, steadily up. Now, there's the rise in antidepressant use too. And then you see go to college campuses today, the percentage of kids that arrive with a diagnosis and a prescription, freshmen, it's like 25 to 30%. Now, do you really think 30% of our kids are mentally ill? But what you've done is you've really put that percentage of our young kid population onto a path where they think of themselves as abnormal, as ill, as compromised. Instead of giving a message of resilience, of, a message of, how you grow into life and what does make people happy. You can't chase happiness. You can't. What you can chase is meaning in life. You can chase doing things that have some meaning to the social good, so to speak. But I can't just try to be happy. That's not happy. Visits you when you're engaged in, social relationships, meaning, community, that sort of thing. So you began with, I think what we're doing to kids with this pathologizing is horrific. It's causing great harm. It's really, what it's doing? It's taking away the right of every child who's born to become the author of their own lives, so to speak, as they grow up, to make choices, to try things out, to decide what they want to be. We're taking that away from them, and actually to grapple with their own minds. I bet you grappled with your mind as you were growing up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't all sweet and, honey.
Oh, no, not at all.
No. Are you glad you had a chance to grapple with your mind?
Absolutely.
See, that's part of what we're taking away. This is wrong. And anyway, finally, we're even putting kids on antipsychotics. Okay? Antipsychotics shrink the frontal lobes. They shrink the brain. Now, why would you do that to a kid? They induce weight gain. They induce all sorts of health problems. They increase the risk for obesity, diabetes, metabolic dysfunction. Why would you do that to a kid? And we're particularly doing it to foster care kids, poor kids. Anyway, you got me up on my soapbox. I think what we're doing to kids is the only way to put it, it's a horrific wrong.
Hmm. And speaking of grappling with the mind, I went to Rutgers University. So, I grew up in the same area. It's next to Milltown, the town next to Milltown.
Is Rutgers a Jesuit? Was it a Jesuit? Was it ever Jesuit?
I'm not sure in its founding. It's a state school. So
I know it's a state school. I just for some reason wondered if it somehow got its start with. Probably not. Go ahead.
I actually don't know that. I grew up with no religion whatsoever. And I ended up getting my degree in religion. And so, because of that grappling question, and I still don't practice one, I just find storytelling fascinating, and which leads me to wonder from a bigger picture perspective about meaning. Right now, I'm seeing a lot of there's been a lot of conflict where people are like anti-science. This whole anti-Fauci, Bill Gates, Soros vaccine thing that's happening. And then you have layered on top of it the protests that have been happening. So you have this convergence of forces that are going on right now. But specifically, we often relate meaning with religion and spirituality. But what you said in the beginning about science, like, I love science as well. And good science is, in a sense, it can be a spiritual endeavor. Like if you look at Hippocrates, right? This question, because it's a constant questioning and not being satisfied and using what works and discarding what doesn't. How would you, in this environment where people say, and without usually understanding the complexity of vaccine science and what has to go into the development of it, how do you educate a public that has become so distrustful in anything related to science, which is becoming, I think, more and more of a percentage? I mean, even with just 10 years ago, 94% of the American public had faith that vaccines worked, and now it's 84%. Yeah. And that's still a large number, but that's moving in the wrong direction. Yeah. How do we get people to have some understanding of what science is right now?
You're asking really good questions. The vaccine's a good one to talk about. I used to think that, first of all, I don't think we should talk to, vaccines can still have risk group, benefit risk to need to be evaluated.
Absolutely.
Not everything is a doesn't have the benefit of a smallpox vaccine or a polio, okay? So I sometimes think that I just want that should be part of the discussion, because that's still a scientific inquiry, whether a new vaccine has a benefit. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. Yes. And sometimes I feel the anti-vaccine movement has made it, because that's like, oh, we don't need any, these vaccines are causing all these problems, and they're against all vaccines. I think that anti-science idea is hindering the idea of looking at vaccines today, new ones, and in some sort of scientific way of how effective are they, what are the risks, that sort of thing. So, but going back to this question about anti-vaccines, I used to think that history would be the way to remind people and look at the infectious death rates. How often did children die of smallpox and these other measles, and how many people ended up paralyzed by polio? Now, I'm so old, I can remember a neighborhood kid crippled by polio. Okay, I was born in 52. And I remember when we took the sugar cube in 57, I think it was, maybe 58, because I remember doing it at school. You cannot believe the joy in my household by my parents. It was like this worry, because we just seen a girl down the street now, have it. The worry that rose, that, lifted from them was extraordinary. Now, I hear this from the anti-vaccine crowd. Oh, that really didn't happen, so to speak. It was all about sanitation. And I do think sanitation is a great thing. But to answer your question is, I used to think those sort of references to history and looking at infectious disease rates before and after, and what happened to polio and what happened to smallpox around the world, et cetera. And it's hard to have that conversation. I mean, it's like it's shut down. And it's really difficult for me because some people conflate critiques of the psychiatric drugs with anti-vaccines. Like, oh, if you're critical of the drugs, you must be one of us in the anti-vaccination crowd. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just looking at the data on the drugs, and it's their own stuff. Does it really show how effective over the short term? What's happening to people long term? But you're on another important question. I don't think you can have a modern society, a society that thrives, that is so anti-science. Yeah. I think this is part of our big problem. I mean, what percentage of people don't believe in climate change today?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't looked at that, but
I think it's like
if it's one, it's a problem.
Well, I think it's like 40% of Americans, something like that. And how about this? This is the most stunning thing. In 1965, what percentage of people didn't believe in evolution in America? In other words, what percentage of people believe that human beings evolved? What do you
I don't
think?
know. In 65,
Yeah.
I'll guess half the population.
No, it's 90 to 95%.
And
Okay.
wow.
And today it's like 45% don't believe in it.
Yeah, that was.
Okay. That's an example of an extraordinary rejection of really, in a way, the fundamental basis of modern science, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that we're, the universe evolves, the Big Bang Theory, everything really if you don't believe in evolution, you don't have a modern scientific mind, right? And so there are many threats to our democracy right now and to our societal well-being, but this rejection of the scientific mind and the inability to even have fact-based discussions is frightening, and I don't get it.
Yeah. And yesterday on my other podcast, I did a 10-minute segment. I run that with two other people, but I did a 10-minute segment on the history of vaccines because I just wanted something out there to just show the development. And I always like to throw in miasma theory because during the bubonic plague, that was the going theory,
Yep.
that the vapors from the clouds. And then I always throw in a story about how during that time, for many centuries, not just then, but that Christians specifically believed that keeping your pores clogged was the best way to keep disease out. And so they didn't bathe. Besides baptism, they never went in water, ever. And
I didn't know this. Okay.
Yeah. There was a book called The Dirt on Clean, which is about the history of sanitation that I read recently. And so their idea was, and this was very big in France. It was mostly European nations, but it also translated into America. The idea was if you changed your linen shirt, you were clean, but you couldn't bathe. Like you might do some facial stuff just because that was presented. Anything else you didn't touch. And people always laugh and stuff, but I try to use that as a way of being like, science evolves. And then we found out germ theory, and then we kind of, things changed, and a lot less people died. But it brings me back to the last question, because I could talk to you all day, honestly, because your work and that whole, I also experienced that with the anti-vax crowd. Like I'm always writing about that crowd. But then when I criticize the SSRIs and SNRIs, people treat me like an anti-vaxxer.
I know, it drives you crazy, right?
It does. And to have to, because it's complex, and that's the problem. Our brain is made to conserve energy, so we look for the simplest route. But I always in my mind is the idea that anecdote is not data, but people live by anecdote. And so when you come across, and I'm sure you've gotten a lot of criticism, I know I've read some on Anatomy of an Epidemic, when you have someone say, but this drug changed my life. A great example is I interviewed Lauren Slater a couple years ago when Blue Dreams came out. And that's a great example of someone who has been on Prozac and then other antidepressants since the 80s and would love nothing more than to get off of them, but can't because of what they've done to her body. And she writes lucidly about this. So when you come across someone who says, but this and this, how do you respond? How can you be able to break through people to shed a little bit of light of the complexity of the issue happening?
Yeah. Well, to start with, I always acknowledge if someone finds something helpful, great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Wonderful. I think there's two things that try to bring into the larger discussion. And of course, well, the first is you do see a spectrum of responses to psychiatric drugs, okay? And so one of the things I'm just looking at is, how does it affect people on average, in the aggregate, which is the scientific question. In other words, you can have a bell curve of responses. And the question is how does it do it in the aggregate? And effectiveness is an aggregate measure, or, the idea that it does more good than harm. So I try to look at the discussion that way. That's the first thing. What are we talking about? Aggregate outcomes. Two, let's talk about informed consent so that people can make decisions as they go on these drugs about risks versus benefits. And then the other thing I do say is this. We need to have some sense of long-term outcomes. Where are you going to be in 5 years, 10 years? Because a lot of people find them helpful for a time, and then next thing you know, they can't get off them. They maybe have sleeping problems, GI problems, whatever it might be. And what we don't know is, so let's say that person at year 1 says, wow, this drug saved my life. And you say, thank God, I'm glad you got it. And then like 5, 10 years later, maybe they're struggling with a lot of the things that happen when you take a drug every day for life, right? And maybe they're on 2 or 3 drugs, which happens. Lauren, I think, is on quite a few drugs at some point, right? Which is a typical path, because the first drug sort of starts losing its efficacy. There's new problems and they get on other drugs. What even the individual person doesn't know, but we don't really know in sort of a conceptual ways, what would that person have been like if, going back to that moment of first crisis, they were given help of a different kind? Okay, that shunted them off in a different way. That's help, but shun them off on a different lifetime course. Where would they be today? And as we try to have a societal discussion on this very topic about the use of these drugs and starting these drugs, is the data is pretty clear they would have a better chance of being well today. That's what the data is pretty clear, especially in terms of like starting on an antidepressant or not. That's an example of this. The data is pretty clear. It's actually pretty clear on the antipsychotics. And so what's missing from that, hey, this drug saved my life, is even their own internal thing. They don't know what their other path might have been, the path not taken might have been. And I just think we need to have a societal discussion that is more robust, rich, and that is, what are we talking about aggregating outcomes? What are longer term outcomes with the drugs? And what do we really see in the absence of drugs but other forms of care? That might emphasize exercise, volunteerism, social interactions, that sort of thing. So I just think we need another discussion. And I think often the discussion about the place of psychiatric drugs in our society gets short-circuited by people who say, oh, it saved my life. What do you say? Don't we need this? And I'll just say, yeah, it's great. I'm so happy. I wish they worked better. And I wish that was for everybody. But the short answer is, we can't let that comment, that anecdotal experience, govern our societal thinking about the drugs as a whole.
I've always had this, even though in college I did a lot of psychedelics, and I still do on occasion, not nearly the frequency, but I do find a lot of value. But I was always skeptical about pills in general. I had friends, I've had family members addicted to opioids, and I've gone through that process. I recently finished reading Dreamland, the book on the opioid, amazing book.
Michael Lewis, right? Was that Michael Lewis?
No, that's not Michael Lewis. Sam Quinones.
Oh, that's a different one. Sorry. Michael Lewis did a thing on psychedelics, didn't he?
That was Michael Pollan.
Michael Pollan, okay, right. All right.
But so
misfiring here right now. Okay, yeah.
Even with when I was on Xanax, I only really took it when I needed, because I know how easy it is to fall into that. And it really did help those times. I mean, I was starting to experience, and it did. And so I agree that in the short term, it's very important. But I know I said the last was the last question, but this is something I've been playing with, and it's not fully formed, but I would love to get your idea on it. I do believe in some capacity that what the mental health crisis, and specifically the antidepressant crisis, could be the next wave of our understanding of what the opioid epidemic has done. And obviously, because it doesn't kill you in the same frequency as opioids, for example, I think that the chronic effects of these substances in a population could be as damaging over the long term. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that to conclude.
Yeah, it's interesting how our country is quite ready to understand that maybe opioids are addictive and problematic when used over a long term. Yeah, listen, I think there's a lot of worry about early Alzheimer's with long-term use of psychiatric drugs, particularly antidepressants. Antipsychotics have tardive dyskinesia, early death, cognitive dysfunction. Stimulants, you do see some cognitive impairment there as well, functional impairment, especially in kids over the longer term. Yeah, I personally think the problem is this. All of these drugs, whether they be opioids or SSRIs, antipsychotics, et cetera, they're all interrupting sort of normal functioning of your neurotransmitter systems. And so what happens in response to that interruption, that perturbation, your brain undergoes these compensatory adaptations, right? So for example, you go on an SSRI antidepressant, which theoretically ups serotonergic activity. What your brain does now is it dials down its own serotonergic activity. You end up with fewer receptors for serotonin. Your brain puts out less serotonin, that sort of thing. And that's probably part of the reason it's so tough to come off, and why with the antidepressants, you have a significant percentage of people who have persistent, withdrawal symptoms, cognition problems, sleeping problems, weird feelings, long after the drug has exited the body. So the problem with psychiatric drugs taken on a daily basis, you use Xanax on an as-needed basis. That's a very different thing with all drugs, because you're not bathing your brain constantly in a drug that your brain has to respond to. In other words, it can be a temporary response to Xanax, but if you're just on an as-needed basis, you're not bathing yourself in this drug that says my brain has to change to compensate for that. Because we don't know with any of the psychiatric drugs, there is no underlying pathology we know about that's being corrected. So if I ask you, Derek, what do you expect about long-term use, daily use of a drug that causes this abnormal functioning in your brain, this change that changes your neurotransmitter levels, changes how your dopamine neurons function, your dopaminergic pathways function, so your serotonergic pathways function? Do you think that is likely to have a good long-term benefit?
No, not at all.
That's the way to think about it, And if we just one final thing in terms of medicine, up until the 70s, I think, late 60s, there wasn't this idea you took medicines long-term. You went in for acute problems, but actually the drug industry in the late 60s saw, the real market is for chronic problems, hypertension, those sort of things, high cholesterol, because then we have a permanent population. I'm not sure those have, anyway, there's problems with responses that rely on drugs over the long term. And in many ways, it's because your body has these compensatory adaptations that go the opposite of the drug, trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium. And I'll give you an example where there's no question a drug provides some benefit, at least for a time. You get Parkinson's disease, right? Now, Parkinson's disease results when you're down to about 20% capacity of your dopaminergic neurons in your, the part of the brain, the basal Niagara. Anyway, I'm forgetting it right now. Anyway, but there's a certain part of your brain that controls motor movements. You lose about 80% of your dopaminergic neurons, okay? So the treatment is L-Dopa to replace that missing dopamine, which makes perfect sense. Now, this is an example of a pathology identified and something that replaces it. But there is, what happens in people with Parkinson's, their own dopaminergic machinery, once you put this other dopamine out there, it continues to decline more rapidly. So one of the problems with long-term medication use is that physical systems tend to become less resilient, if you understand what I mean. It drives the physiology of the body in an opposite direction so often, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's why you'll see weight gain.
You'll see weight gain. The opiates, I think, lose their pain mediating power after time as well. And that's part of the reason for that. Your brain is adapting to the presence of the drug.